let's get started. I'll introduce myself a little bit into the talk. But we're going to talk about secure access to Hadoop from Tableau today. And Hadoop is like 10 years old. And it's early development, you probably all know, go back even further. How many of you are actually using Hadoop today with Tableau? Or, so how many of you have Hadoop, but are not using it with Tableau, but it's inside your organizations? So you're moving towards using it, okay? So, and if there's anybody not using it at all, or what are you using it for? Tableau and Hadoop. Okay, so we're going to go and talk about the accessing it securely. But in the early days, Hadoop was very open. It only really had one use case, and that was to index the public web. So there was no real security early on. But in the intermediate 10 years, it has grown up quite a bit. So it's matured quite a bit. And it's now obviously a very large and data platform for all types of data and all types of use cases. So we know that. And so and with Tableau, it's become a platform for self-service analytics. So with all that data that's inside Hadoop, we don't want to lock it away from end users. We want to enable users to get access to that data. But that requires some governance and security. But we can't do it in such a way that nobody can get access to the data. So my role is helping our customers get access to the data in Hadoop securely and in a governed way, and in a way that is very more friendly. Or I think of it as friendly governance or friendly security, because that's what most of our end users want or need. Is they need the security, but they need access to the data transparently in most cases. So that's where the single sign-on comes in. So we're going to talk about how to access a secure cluster, but we're going to talk about things like single sign-on or transparent sign-on, where the users connect in the context of their authentication in Tableau all the way through the database, and the different techniques that we can use in Tableau and enable in the Hadoop cluster to gain access. So my name is Robin Cortes. I am a strategic sales consultant here in the US. So apart from helping people see and understand their data, I help them enjoy their food. I like baking pizzas and baking bread, so that's my brick oven in my backyard. And I've got another talk with a colleague later in the week about how we connected that brick oven up to the internet and AWS. So that's for Thursday. People say that I look like Rick Steves. I don't know who knows Rick Steves, the travel writer, but I don't see the resemblance at all. But maybe you do. But somebody did when I was showing them my photos. I live in New Jersey. How many of you live in New Jersey or come from New Jersey or the Northeast, or where do you all come from? So different parts. So that's most people's view of New Jersey, is the turnpike and traffic. But I actually live in this part of New Jersey. It's in northwest New Jersey, about 50 miles west of New York City. And around about this time of year, this is how my hometown looks. This is Morris County. So this is Long Valley, Morris County, so about 50 miles west. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a very nice area. So today, what I wanted to do was go through how Tableau can be connected to a secured Hadoop cluster in such a way that users can get single sign-on, and also authenticate to the database, to the cluster, to the data as a known user. So end-to-end single sign-on. So if you're all Tableau administrators, you might already have single sign-on of the users to the Tableau server. We want to enable Tableau authentication or single sign-on all the way through to the data, and in this case, the Hadoop cluster. So Tableau supports many different types of single sign-on all the way through the database. I help customers connect to SQL Server and Oracle and other databases, but today we're going to be focused on Hadoop because it's a relatively, even though it's 10 years old, it's still relatively new and a changing, developing platform. There are capabilities for authentication and authorization being added all the time. Tableau is, and there are different distributions of Hadoop, and so they all have some variance about how they do authentication. So we're going to talk mostly about that and about the single sign-on, how we do impersonation or can take advantage of impersonation and delegation features of Hadoop and the drivers and Tableau to get the right sort of authentication of users on Tableau server. We're going to start, of course, looking at Tableau desktop, but at the end of the day, the goal is for most of our users who have got a large cluster of Hadoop or data installations, they're mostly interested in how to get single sign-on for their web browser users via Tableau server. So we're going to start in desktop. We're going to see how that connects up to sort of create content and data connections, and then look at the publishing options of those data connections and workbooks in such a way that the web users or mobile users of the content gain access through Tableau server to the cluster, to the data. And so we'll touch a little bit on as well as the delegation and impersonation. We'll touch a little bit about how we can do single sign-on and row-level security, which is not necessarily built into the platform yet. I'll take questions as we're going along if possible, but there'll definitely be some time at the end to take more questions. And if we have enough time and we want to dig a little bit deeper, we can talk about SSL and how to troubleshoot a connection if you haven't already gone through that process, and even how to do proxying. Most of the time I'm going to be talking about using Cloudera as an example. I've got a little example of Hortonworks, but there are variants on each of the distributions, the Hadoop distributions. But we'll talk a little bit about how to enable a proxy for Impala, for example. So there's one statement right in the beginning. If you go and look at the Apache documentation for Hadoop, which is the open source platform that all of the distributions are mostly based on, it says right at the beginning of a section about secure mode, it says that for each user and service needs to be authenticated by Kerberos to be able to have a secure environment or a secure cluster. And people talk about Kerberizing or having a Kerberized cluster. This statement, although it's right at the beginning of this old document, and I keep looking at the latest versions of Apache to see if it's changed. This one was I found it on 2.7.2. I think the latest stable version is 2.7.3, and version 3 is in beta. This statement hasn't changed. Strictly speaking, this is not true. While you might, to be able to create a secure cluster, you might need to enable Kerberos. It is not strictly true that user access from BI tools like Tableau need Kerberos to authenticate. Now, a lot of customers come to us expecting that they need to enable Kerberos, and Tableau now, and especially in version 10, supports Kerberos end-to-end to a lot of the distributions, but it's not strictly necessary. And I'm going to show you how you can do secure access and get single sign-on with what's either called LDAP or username and password authentication. Even to a Kerberized cluster, and I'll use a cluster that I've got, which is Kerberized, but I'll show how we can actually go through LDAP. And in fact, I'm going to start with LDAP because Kerberos itself to configure, especially for client tools, is quite a challenge. It can be quite a challenge. And so a lot of our customers use LDAP for one reason or another. And so I'm going to show that first. And it affects how you connect to Tableau from desktop, and then it affects how you publish. But you can actually end up getting single sign-on, and you can actually get single sign-on delegation or impersonation of the actual ultimate user using LDAP. And that's ultimately what the user experience that we're aiming for, that single sign-on. So I'm going to show what some of the options are. And we will show Kerberos. In version 10, we enabled full end-to-end Kerberos using constrained delegation. So we can actually do it, but it's not necessarily necessary. It's not necessarily the best way to do it in the long run. You've got options. Knox is a special case. Horton, for their, they recommend for BI tools like Tableau that are out in the, outside of the cluster. They have adopted an Apache component called Knox, which is a gateway to the cluster, and that hides the complexity of Kerberos, as does LDAP. So you don't have to worry about installing Kerberos or setting up Kerberos necessarily on Tableau or your desktops or Tableau server to be able to use LDAP or Knox. So I'll just go through the sort of what it looks like, the experience of connecting through Knox and what it means for you. So. We can jump out to a demo if necessary, but I'll just go through the sort of screen shots for the moment, and we'll see if we can go and do some live, because sometimes it's useful to actually go and do it. But how many of you are familiar with Tableau desktop and how connecting to a database? So I think you all kind of know the kind of typical connection experience. I'm going to go through to some of the specifics of the Tableau connection experience for the different types of Kerberos, different types of Hadoop cluster. So what people understand is LDAP perhaps on the Hadoop cluster side. If you go to the connection experience with Tableau on desktop or the ODBC driver, it's username and password. But that's basically using a user that is defined in a directory, like Active Directory or an LDAP directory that's been set up in Hadoop, and using that as your authentication mechanism from desktop. So when we're talking about connecting from Tableau desktop, we're really thinking about the stage of when you're creating content. Think of somebody's creating a workbook or a data source that they're then going to publish to Tableau server. So think of this as the sort of bootstrap, the first thing that anybody has to do to enable access to a visualization, a viz on Tableau server. Somebody has to create it on Tableau desktop. And that's what we're going to talk about first. And then we'll go through to, depending on what options you use to connect to the cluster from desktop, we'll see what options start to come out from when you publish. And that's how you end up getting the different single sign-on options. So I want to sort of tie that together. So this is the Tableau connection experience, or the connection for Impala, using username and password. So this is basically an LDAP connection. It allows you to connect to Impala with a known username and password, and that username and password could be in the case that I've got working, I can demonstrate, is actually an Active Directory user. So that's known to Hadoop, but that's who you're connecting as. But it does have a username and password. So in this, effectively, this is a Windows username and password, but it's not the Windows username that's running the Windows, logged onto Windows. It could be, it's not connected, and that's important to understand when we get to Kerberos. But there obviously are some things that you need to know and that is the server, which is the Impala endpoint. In this case, I'm using a proxy, which we'll talk later. So this is actually effectively a load balancer that sort of distributes the connections to various Impala daemons. And so it has a port. Those of you who are used to connecting to Impala, the default port would be 21 or 50, something like that. But here we're talking to a proxy. But it's the same thing. It's going to be the same experience all the way through when I demonstrate, when I show you this, all the different options, whether we're talking to a proxy or either directly to a Hadoop, an Impala daemon, for example. It's the same kind of experience. You just need to know the name and the port.
Only Kerberos enabled.
Yes, that's it. Yes, yes. Go on.
Yeah,
that's the question. Yeah.
So the question was, in this scenario, the Hadoop environment where we are trying to connect is already Kerberos enabled.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So let's assume that, and we can go at the end. We can go into what that actually means. But effectively, this environment has been set up to allow for LDAP connection and Kerberos, as we'll see. It's going to support both, but it's effectively has already been set up. So, and that's the important thing. It will need to be set up. It will have been needed to be connected to the directory. So there's a process that your Hadoop administrators will have gone through to Kerberize or create a secure cluster. And then we come in as the Tableau client or Tableau desktop. They're going to provide this information, and you on the Tableau desktop or the content creator will need this information. So they'll need to know that, one, you're obviously connecting to something like Impala. You could be connecting to Hive Server 2. But we're using, as the authentication mechanism, we're using username and password. And we'll see what the different options are. Now, and to connect with Kerberos, it's slightly different. So we could be talking to the same exact Hadoop cluster here. And in fact, in my demo environment, that's exactly what we're doing. We're only talking about one cluster. We can actually connect either way. But with Kerberos, what we're doing from Tableau Desktop is the Windows user who's authenticating when they log into the desktop with their Windows username, that is the username that will be used to authenticate seamlessly to the cluster. So that's a single sign-on experience right there, even from desktop. And that's what, if you select the Kerberos option on Tableau, which is what it looks like here, the only difference between, we're connecting to the same server, same port, same type, but in Tableau you've got this drop-down that also has Kerberos on it. And with a Kerberos authentication, we don't enter, obviously, a username or password. We don't even enter the username because you've already logged on to Windows with that username. But what you do need is some Kerberos-specific, more Kerberos-specific information, which you would get from your Hadoop administrator. So there's the realm is the Kerberos realm, so that's defined on the cluster. The fully qualified domain name, again, is the name as it's known inside Kerberos, or inside the cluster for that Kerberos cluster. And you might notice it's not necessarily the same as the server endpoint. This is just the DNS name of the cluster from outside. This name is what it's known as inside that I'm connecting to. This is actually the proxy's internal, fully qualified domain name. In a lot of cases, your setup might be the same, but it doesn't have to be. But that's something that your Hadoop administrator would need to tell you. But this gives you a single sign-on from desktop. And that's important because we're going to get, once we get fully using Kerberos later on, I'm going to show you when we publish, we're going to get different options when you publish the content. Now, Knox, so the examples that I used before were to a Cloudera cluster. I don't have I might be able to connect to a Knox cluster today, but I'm not planning on it. What Knox is basically a gateway to the cluster. And so it sits, it's installed in the cluster, but it's a gateway to clients like Tableau. And it's actually a REST API gateway, a REST API service that allows a Tableau desktop to connect with username and password to Hadoop. And again, without worrying about how Kerberos is set up on that. So it encapsulates Kerberos and hides that complexity from the client tool like Tableau. When you're connecting from Tableau, you've got a slightly different option on the authentication. So in this case, we're connecting to a Horton, Works cluster. It has a port, and it's the port of the gateway, which we'll see. And in this case, we're going to connect the Hive Server 2 because Horton Works can typically deploy Impala as its sort of low latency analytic endpoint, SQL on Hadoop endpoint. But the authentication option is HTTP or HTTPS, and that is effectively telling Tableau Desktop that we're going to connect to a Knox gateway, because that's what a Knox gateway is. It's because it's a REST endpoint. It's actually communicating over HTTP or HTTPS. But it is a username and password connection, so those are, again, set up on the cluster. But this extra information that is required would be given to you by your Hadoop administrator would be the actual path of the gateway. That's something that they would have to give you, and it's basically like a URL basically on top of that server, and that's the gateway that you're going to authenticate against. Okay, so there are different ways to connect desktop to your data source. So remember, we're kind of in the mode of creating content, like a workbook or a data source that we're going to publish to a data server. So that's as far as we've got so far. So you've got, depending on the distribution or even within the distribution, you potentially could be connecting with LDAP or with a username and password, or you could be connecting with Kerberos. But our goal is to provide single sign-on for our browser users, or the consumers of our published content. That's our ultimate goal, so that when they connect through their web browser to a visualization, what we really want, or potentially want, is for them to connect to the database as that user, effectively as the user that's viewing the content. That's what most people mean by single sign-on. So if I connect as Robin to Tableau, I need to connect as Robin to Hadoop also. But I don't want to log in twice. I don't want 2 prompts, anything like that. And ideally, I want as few prompts as possible. So that's the sort of ease of use, the single sign-on that most people are looking for. And we do this outside of Hadoop. I spent a lot of time helping customers do things like SAML single sign-on and single sign-on to HANA and SQL Server. This is not a requirement that's limited to Hadoop. It's a requirement that's for a lot of databases, for virtually every database. And so I'm going to show you the different options of getting single sign-on using either impersonation or on delegation, or with the different authentication techniques like LDAP and Kerberos. So remember, we don't need necessarily to Kerberize this thing end-to-end to get a good single sign-on, a secure and a good user experience for single sign-on. That's kind of probably my main point today. And so you've got options. So if you're all used to creating content on Tableau, you create content on desktop and then you publish it to Tableau server. And if you haven't connected to a a Kerberized, or if you haven't connected to Kerberos before to Hadoop, you might not have seen some of the options that you get. Has anybody used Tableau against SQL Server, for example? Have you used Kerberos for SQL Server? Do you know? Or,
I think we're using SAML right now.
sorry?
I think we're using SAML right now, not Kerberos.
SAML?
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, for SQL Server, that would be SAML from the trying to use a browser to Tableau. And then maybe you've got something else for Tableau to SQL Server, but so like a impersonation or something like that. So, okay, we'll get to how these different options sort of come together. I'll probably come back to this table in summary later on, because when you, and I'll show the Tableau desktop version of this as well, but when you publish content or a data source, you're going to get these different options depending on how you connected to your data source. Whether you can, and some of them are more obvious than others, and that's where I want to sort of build on the options to show how to get true single sign-on. I've grayed out a little bit prompt user because that's obviously not a single sign-on technique. That's where if you publish a workbook, once the user signs on to Tableau and then they connect the workbook, the visualization, it's going to prompt them connect to the database. So that's usually the situation that most customers don't want at all. It's the last thing that you want. On the other hand, it actually could be, there are reasons for it still being there. You might need a user to be prompted to connect to the database as some user other than themselves. But it's not the usual requirement, the ideal requirement. But then what you can do in most cases is, when you're connecting with LDAP, for example, you can embed a password, and that means that it's going to connect as the user that published. So to me, that's transparent sign-on. It's not necessarily single sign-on, but it's transparent in terms of the user experience. It can be quite, useful if you just connect as some user, a proxy user, say, and give the viz. If you don't need to do row-level security or strong authorizations on the database, embedding the password is a valid way to get seamless sign-on to the database. But then you can do impersonation, and we'll come to viewer credentials as the Kerberos option, where you can effectively connect to the database as the user that's viewing the visualization. And then you can take advantage of authorizations on the server, like Sentry and Ranger on the different Hadoop clusters. Because you know who the user is, you can control the content and potentially do row-level security because you know who the user is. So that's our kind of goal. But again, we can get that experience with LDAP just as easily, if not easier, than Kerberos. So we don't have to go all the way to Kerberos to get a good single sign-on experience. That's my point. I keep jumping down here. Here we go. So let's now look at when we've connected earlier on with Tableau desktop to the cluster using LDAP, and we publish the Tableau server, we start to see the sort of options that you get for publishing that content. And so this is the publishing view. So when you go to server, we've connected to Tableau or a Tableau server already. We are now going to look at the options for authenticating the user, the Tableau server, to the Hadoop cluster when the user views the visualization, the viz. So this is what this managed data sources section says. It's basically telling Tableau server how to connect to the database. In our case, it's going to tell how to connect to the Hadoop cluster. So remember, we've talked about prompt user now, and so that would, if you did that when the user connected to the visualization, and we'll see it in a minute, the user will be prompted for their database credentials. It'll default to the publisher user, but they'll be forced to enter a password, but they can also override the username if they have a different username. So that's what prompt user does. Now, embedded password is, like I said, when the desktop user publishes this content, they're saying, I want the viewer of the workbook or the viz on the web, on the Tableau server, to use my credentials. But they're going to be encrypted, they're going to be hidden, but it is going to connect directly to Hadoop as the publisher. So you can think of that, if you can, embedded password, you can think of use the publisher credential, the publisher's credentials, the person who published from the desktop to the server. And this is true of both workbooks and data sources, by the way. Now, impersonate via embedded password requires some setup on the Hadoop cluster. But this is, again, this is not Kerberos, but it allows us to get single sign-on as the consumer of the published content. They will effectively connect to Hadoop as themselves. But it's not done directly, it's done via impersonation. And that requires some setup on the Hadoop cluster to say that the publisher username, which it's not shown here, but remember we had a user called LDAP user. That user is set up to allow to delegate or allow impersonation to other users, and you can actually define that in Impala. So that's what impersonate via embedded password means. That is going to give the consumer, the consumer of the published content, that will give them a really good single sign-on experience, and it will effectively connect them to the cluster as that user as themselves. So that's important, and that's using LDAP. So again, it doesn't need Kerberos all the way end to end to get that single sign-on experience, and hopefully we'll see it some of it. Yeah.
For impersonation, then
Hold on. Yeah. Thanks.
For impersonation, all activity statistics that are being logged are going to be logged as the user who signed in or as the impersonated user.
Well, you'll see both, and that's actually an important point. So it will authenticate, the user that will be authenticated will be the publisher, but there's an effect in Impala anyway. Inside Impala, there is an effective user field, which is the person using Tableau who's being impersonated. So you can actually see both, and you can actually leverage the Sentry or the authorization setup to be based on, and the auditing basically to be based on the effective user. So you haven't completely lost the original user. That's a great question. When we went back to embedded password, that's a situation where we know nothing about who the actual real live user is, because with embedded password, you are connecting with the single username, the publisher, in all cases. All right? So it's invisible to the, it's a seamless sign-on to the actual consumer, the viewer of the viz, all the way through the database, but the database only sees one user. With impersonation, the database sees both users. So the actual primary authentication is the Tableau publisher, to jump back into Tableau terms. But we then have set it up so that that user can be impersonated. And it becomes the effective user. And there's actually a SQL field. It's a function, a miscellaneous function in Impala that says effective user. So there's a user function and an effective user function. And if we get time, I'll show it to you, or I'll put it in the content. We might have some of it in the content later on. So you get to know who the effective user is. So that's what you get with LDAP. Now let's look at Kerberos end-to-end. With Kerberos, we're doing something similar. So remember, with Kerberos, we've got the the Windows user on the Tableau desktop was the one that authenticated to Hadoop. And also, the Tableau server would need to be set up for Kerberos to be able to publish with Kerberos to Tableau server. And Tableau server also needs to know about Hadoop Kerberos. So this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, saying if you really want end-to-end Kerberos, there's a lot, some more setup than with LDAP. And so that's the kind of downside. But a lot of our customers think to get secure single sign-on that they need this Kerberos end-to-end. So Tableau now supports this, but you have to be aware that you're going to be sort of sharing or syncing Active Directories. There's a relationship between your users in Tableau server, a very direct relationship between your users in Tableau server and your Hadoop cluster users. You're kind of assuming that they're all sharing a common directory, a common Active Directory in a lot of cases. But when that's true, when that condition is met, you can get Kerberos from desktop, you can get Kerberos from Tableau server, and you get a really nice Kerberos single sign-on experience. So let's look at how you would take advantage of that once those pieces are in place. If I connect from desktop to Hadoop via Kerberos, and Tableau is enabled for Kerberos to Hadoop, you get some different options on publish. Now, these are sometimes, so a lot of times when customers will say, I want to connect Tableau using Kerberos, I just don't see how to do it. None of the options make any sense to me. And that's because until you kind of have Kerberos working end-to-end, you won't see the options that you need to get the true single sign-on. And so these options are slightly different from our LDAP case. But they're sort of equivalent to a large extent, except for the last one. The last one is the sort of money shot, if you like, what we're aiming for if you really want a true single sign-on Kerberos authentication. But if you've got Kerberos enabled from Tableau and all the way from the user to Hadoop, you'll get these different options. So server run as account means that when you publish content from Tableau desktop to the server, when it connects to Hadoop, it will authenticate as the run as user for Tableau, the service account. So that's a Windows account, but that will be the actual authenticator, not the publisher anymore. It's a Windows user that's running Tableau server. So they would have to exist on your Hadoop cluster as a user to be able to make that single sign-on connection, that transparent connection, right? Okay. Same for impersonate via the server run as account. That means that you're connecting with this Windows server run as user, but they are again going to impersonate the actual browser user, the viewer. So again, it's the same situation as with LDAP. The primary authenticating user is a single, service account or proxy account, that happens to be the Tableau run as user, but it's going to say, please impersonate this user, which is the viewer, the actual viewer on Tableau, or the browser in this case. Okay. So these are all, like I said, transparent sign-on options. The end user will connect seamlessly. They won't be prompted for any more credentials, but they'll be using either the run as user or the
Somebody else's ID.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be hiding behind some
Yes.
other ID other than their own.
Right. But with impersonation via the run as account, they'll get that effective user as themselves. All right. So that's where the impersonation comes in. Sorry, did you have a question? Okay. All right. So that's what. Now viewer credentials is something that you won't see until you've got everything Kerberized properly. For Tableau set up for Kerberos, Hadoop set up for Kerberos, and it all tying together. Now, viewer credentials means that it doesn't matter who published the content, who I connected to when I published the content. The actual user that will authenticate to Hadoop will be the viewer of the visualization, in a web browser. So, it could be a desktop, but imagine the usual case is a web browser user. And that's what we mean by viewer credentials. So it's fairly self-explanatory in that case. That is the user that will authenticate. But it's done using a specific Kerberos technique called constraint delegation, because you've got Tableau in between the browser and Hadoop. You need to use what's called a sort of a double hop type setup, where it's Tableau server that's going to talk to Hadoop, but it's basically going to say, please, I want to delegate the connection to the viewer, and it'll actually authenticate. As far as Hadoop is concerned, it will authenticate as the viewer. So the run as account doesn't necessarily have to exist as a user in Hadoop, that can select anything. Because of the way that the constraint delegation works. So viewer credentials is a very powerful Kerberos technique to get single sign-on. The downside being that you have to set it up across the whole Tableau, the desktop, and Hadoop, okay? So that's the downside of it. But if you've got that capability, if you're able to do that, set up your clients and your Tableau server and the Hadoop server that way, you will get true single sign-on with Kerberos. So I think I'm sorry, I'm going backwards. Hold on. Let's see what I wanted to show next. So when you connect for impersonation, the one thing that you have to do on the Hadoop side, in this case, it's actually an Impala setting, so I'm kind of assuming that we're connecting to Impala on Cloudera for this example, is you would set up who can impersonate who. So that's actually a configuration that you would need to do on Cloudera, and it's a string, and it's basically saying the user that connects will. Or the user that connects will be able to be impersonated if the user that published is the first user. So in the case of this string up here, this is a series of users. It's basically saying that if I publish as LDAP user 3, I will allow LDAP user 4 to be a viewer and be impersonated by me. So that's what that says. So that's a single sort of one-to-one impersonation. More typically, you'll get either a wildcard that says, if I publish as this user, I'll let anybody be impersonated by me, and I'll worry about what rights they have by another tool like Sentry. So this just says who can connect. And so, for example, LDAP user 2, if I were to publish content as LDAP user 2, Tableau users could be, for example, LDAP user 4, 1, and 1. That's what it's saying. So you can impersonate multiple users. And so that whole string sets up the impersonation rules. Before we go to troubleshooting, let's see if we can do some examples of that. Because it's all good in theory, but I wanted to show some examples of Tableau connecting with LDAP and Kerberos. So this Tableau desktop is on my laptop, which is going to talk to a Hadoop server somewhere out in AWS. Although the Hadoop server is Kerberized, I'm not going to connect with Kerberos because I can't, because my desktop is not on the same domain or has any relationship to the Kerberos realm that Hadoop is running on. So that's this situation. So we're going to use LDAP to connect. So what I would do is, let's just start with a new workbook. How are we for time, Malik? We've got 15 minutes, okay. So we probably, I'll go through this quickly. So I'll just give you a flavor of what the different options are, just to sort of solidify what I showed in the PowerPoint. What they sort of, remember, this is the desktop publisher. This is the process right at the beginning of creating content. So I'm going to connect to Cloudera Hadoop. So all the drivers, the ODBC driver for Impala is installed on the desktop. Sorry, yes?
If you have a certificate secure connection, is the only way to connect through ODBC, or is there a way to do it through this connection that specifies certificate?
You can only connect to Hadoop, and most of our connections to databases are through ODBC. But you can connect with a certificate through ODBC, like an SSL certificate.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. But for Impala, it requires, on Tableau, what we call a TDC file. So it's a file that kind of customizes the ODBC connection. And it does the equivalent. And I can kind of show you a little bit of that on the troubleshooting, or we can talk later in more detail. But every connection that we're talking about today is ODBC. There is no, until we have JDBC, for example, you're only going to connect to Cloudera or a Hadoop cluster with an ODBC driver. So it might be an ODBC driver for Hive or Hive Server 2, or it might be an ODBC driver for Spark SQL or Presto or any of the other SQL on Hadoop endpoints, but they're basically all ODBC drivers. Well, you can do SSL connections, and different ones have different levels of support for the SSL and customizing the certificate. So it's not the fact whether you can do it outside of ODBC, it's how you customize ODBC to get the SSL or the TLS connection.
Show that after?
Yeah, I can show that after. Because that's a common kind of requirement. Once you set up a secure connection, you want to set up a secure kind of pathway through, but I'll show that. All right, so one of the nice things about Tableau 10, and especially 10.1 gets even better, it'll remember your last connections for all your databases. So if you're a content creator, this is a great boon. So remember, we're connecting to a cluster. It just happens to be a proxy on the cluster on port 2151. 2151, we're going to Impala. We're using username and password. So these are some of the options that you get. Some of them don't make sense for Cloudera. So, but Kerberos, and no authentication is going back 10 years. Remember when those like elephants were running free? That's how it started off. You could, if you install Cloudera, a Hadoop cluster today, that it wouldn't be secure at all. You wouldn't need any authentication to get in. That's how it works. So,
Let's say you have the Hadoop environment.
go on.
Let's say you have the Hadoop environment, which is Kerberos
Yes.
enabled, right?
Yes.
And now you want to connect this desktop using no authentication. It won't.
No, that won't
right?
work.
It won't work.
It won't work. You'd never get in. I mean, we could try it, but I think once you enable Kerberos and LDAP, you're just not. It's not going to allow you. So
Right.
that's But at this point when we're connecting, we don't know that. Unfortunately, I wish we could hide the option, but you don't know that.
Right.
So it gives you every option. But yep.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the error message might not be that descriptive, but that's what's happening is because this is a secure cluster, we're only going to be able to connect with LDAP or Kerberos, because I've enabled LDAP and Kerberos.
So LDAP and Kerberos both are enabled on the server.
Yes,
And
they are. In my case, they're both enabled, and
Okay.
and I'm not really I'm not sure whether you can disable one versus the other. Like you can probably disable LDAP, and keep only Kerberos, so you might not get both options. But in my case, I've enabled both to show that you actually can do both.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking,
Okay.
so server can be enabled for both Kerberos and LDAP,
Absolutely.
not for Windows 80.
Well, this is the Hadoop cluster we're talking to.
Okay,
At this
so-
point,
no.
at this point, this is Tableau desktop talking direct to a Hadoop cluster.
Got it, okay.
So there is no, until we publish, there's no Tableau server in the picture because there's no connection. We're not using Tableau server yet.
Okay,
Not as a directory. It's using AD. But I am going to show you, if we can get to it in time, I'm going to show you connecting from a Tableau server that is enabled for Active Directory. In fact, it's gone one step further. It's enabled for Kerberos.
okay.
And I'll show you the sign-on experience and then the connection experience. But at this stage, my desktop is not connected to the same Active Directory, or LDAP directory that the Hadoop cluster is. They're completely unrelated. But that's what I wanted to show is I can get a username and password connection. And I don't have a SSL enabled, but I can connect as a user. So I'm going to connect as LDAP user 4 to Hadoop. All right. So here's my Hadoop cluster. I can see only the tables that LDAP user 4 is allowed to see. So Sentry is in play. So any rules or authorization rules that are on the cluster are in play. They are being applied. So again, it's a secure cluster. I'll just connect very quickly to some airline data. And so I see all the tables that I'm allowed to see. I'm just going to get some data so that we can do a publish. So let's look at the airtime. So this is a live Hadoop cluster that's actually up on AWS. It's a cluster that's got 5 Impala nodes, if you want. It's not a big cluster, but it's not a VM. It's not the sandbox. It's got some different data nodes and Impala nodes. Okay, so I'm now going to publish this content. I'm going to publish to a Tableau server that also is not connected to the Hadoop cluster in any way. It's just a Tableau server. It actually you'll see it actually authenticates with SAML, it's not connected. It's using Tableau's local authentication, local provisioning. It's got nothing to do with AD. It's just going to hold on. We'll see how this works. Actually, I'm going to make it even simpler. I'm going to do localhost. I actually remembered my connection, but when I go to publish the workbook, and it would be the same for publishing the data source, I'm going to get the options that I talked about for LDAP. So let's take, we'll just do this. We're probably not going to go through all of the combinations because we're running out of time, but that's the impersonating with embedded password. So when I publish that, it'll publish the workbook, and then hopefully it will, because connecting as a certain user, this user may or may not work because this user that I published as, or signed in as, is not actually in Hadoop. And so even though I published as a valid Hadoop user because we were able to build the viz, it won't let me connect. But if I sign in as somebody else who is able to connect, we can connect as LDAP user 4. This is the one we just did. So let's see if this one works. So we should get our view that I just published. But it's actually now my Tableau server is talking to the Hadoop cluster. but it's doing it as LDAP user 4. It's actually LDAP user 4 impersonating itself. So I should try it with a different user, but I wanted to show the Kerberos case before, because we're running out of time. So I'm remote desktoping into terminal services to a Windows machine that does belong to a cloud, a cluster. And so if I create a new workbook here, again, if I connect to the data here, if I again select Cloudera, then I go, and this kind of time I use Kerberos, so it's remembered my connections. It's going to connect as my Windows user, which is actually a Kerb user 4. It's who I logged onto the Windows account as. So once I connect here, I get the building of the viz, is going to be the same experience. So for the content creator, nothing's different. It might be who I can, be different who I can see. Connect to the same database. Have a look at the cancellation carrier delay or something like that. Slightly, probably going to look very similar. Whoops. All right, so it looks slightly different. So when I connect to the server now, if I'm now going to sign into a server that is on the same domain, Active Directory domain, as my desktop, so it's actually going to do a Kerberos authentication from desktop to the server, and it's also connected to the same domain as the Hadoop cluster. And so what we'll get is, I'll get a true single sign-on experience. I don't have to prompt or anything like it, even if this was the first time. And then I'm going to show you the publish option and how you get a slightly different set of set of options. And so here you've got the viewer credentials. So what I'll do is publish that. We'll just say keep it short. So once I publish this, we'll get I don't know if I've got it here. Let's see if it's going to work. This user should actually connect with Kerberos end-to-end, which it did. But it's complete. It's the same as LDAP. From the user experience, it looks very similar, which is what we are aiming for, but it's single sign-on. But in fact, that user used Kerberos from the web browser. It picked up the user's Windows account, used it to connect to Hadoop, but using the Tableau's run as user as the delegator, so the Tableau's run as user said, I know who connected to me. It was Kerb user 4. I'm going to connect to Cloudera, in this case Impala, as Kerb user 4 and delegate to that user. So Cloudera only ever sees Kerb user 4. That's the user, not just the effective user. So you've got single sign-on. Sorry?
What Cloudera version is being
It's
used
actually
here?
5.7. It's not that recent.
Okay.
It's a CDH 5.7. So this has all been available for quite a while.
Okay.
We've added the Kerberos in Tableau in version 10.0. So that's what, that was a few months ago, that this whole end-to-end delegation became available. But it's been available in Impala, Cloudera for a while. And I recommend that people keep up to date with the ODBC drivers. You should be using the latest. But this has been available for a while. It doesn't need the latest, okay?
Thank you.
So let's wrap. So we've hit right the time. So I'm happy to talk to people, or they can contact me later on. I'm accessible. I help our customers all the time setting this up in more detail. I'm happy to get on the phone and discuss some of these things, especially when you're planning or when you're coming around to do it, and looking in more closer detail what the Tableau setup is, okay?
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you so much.
Can you guys give a big hand to Robin, please, for awesome presentation?